Does everybody see my screen?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I did notice that some people are, that we may be blocking part of the screen. The pictures, the heads may be blocking part of the screen, but that's okay. So I want to thank you all for the opportunity to present some current events about COVID pandemic and its relationship to climate change, and how the pandemic could work in favor of the environment, but how it's also being used as a distraction. So there's good news and bad news. Is it really possible that there's any good news? I don't know. But why is it not letting me go to the next? Oh, there we go. The good news is a very simple message. The world response to COVID-19 shows us that people of the world can respond as a global unified force in a life and death crisis, even if our own country's leadership is the least competent, and we will probably therefore suffer the most avoidable deaths. The World Health Organization and the United Nations have been strategic leaders. Even the UN, despite flaws, we know that there are flaws. The UN has even seen the opportunity of climate mitigation in its article about green, in its articles and writings about green recovery. And I'll share some more of that in a little while. Here you can see the article on bicycle use post-COVID, the anticipation that there may be continued use of bicycles. It's shown that It's shown that we can reduce our consumption of fossil fuels and begin to make the supply chain more locally based. The agricultural supply chain, it really turns out it will fail. It won't be adequate at this point because of the just-in-time, commercial production and agribusiness, which has turned, their approaches to food production. But it's raised the issue, which is good. But as it turns out, local food production can fulfill demand for less than 1/3 of the population. Of course, that raises the question about the carrying load of the world, but that's another conversation. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that we can simplify our needs, and this is a huge lesson. We can simplify our needs back to a more sustainable level. Notwithstanding and not being Pollyanna-ish about the complexities of economics, jobs, and sustainability, just that we can move ourselves back to a more sustainable level of consumption. Climate destruction is a life and death crisis, and the global response to COVID can be a model for us, both in response in terms of that we can work as a unified force, and in actual actions, like not picking up where we left off with luxury trips and imported consumption. In a sense, the model is already in action in the country, and worldwide response to the murder in plain sight of George Floyd. When we think about the role that media play in how we think, believe, and behave, I thought this article by Hertzgaard and Pope was particularly interested, and I've noticed that some of the media have been picking up on the concept. But this, just to summarize that, what they're saying, that pandemic is a tragic reminder about how important journalism is, especially in a crisis. And by highlighting what the medical experts say, and what rather than fake controversies, such as reporting, such reporting is helping to push the U.S. debts lower than it would otherwise would be. Now is the time for the same journalistic rigor and urgency around the other great crisis of our time. The overlap between the coronavirus and the climate crisis are many, and the same best practices when it comes to reporting are needed. But then there's the bad news. And here comes the bad news on COVID-19 and climate. So I wanted to actually read this. This is an excerpt. It's actually a whole scene from a book by mostly by Malena Ernman, who's Greta Thunberg's mother. She's written a sort of a biography of their family called Our House is on Fire, Scenes of a Family and Planet in Crisis. This scene is sort of describes a scene in their living room. Starts out with what's happening on the television. It says, sometimes we human beings mess things up. The Prime Minister is talking about the climate in a direct broadcast from Parliament. He's lying, Greta says, getting up from the sofa in front of the TV. He's lying. What do you mean, I ask? I is Malena Ernman. He says that it's we people who have messed it up, but it's not correct. I'm a person and I haven't messed it up. Beate, who's Greta's sister, hasn't messed it up. And you and Dad haven't done it either, at least not that much. No, I guess you're right about that. He's just saying that so we will carry on as usual, because if everyone is guilty, no one is guilty, but someone is actually guilty. So what he's saying isn't true. There are like 100 big companies that account for almost all emissions. And there are a few extremely rich men who have made thousands of billions destroying the whole planet, even though they know all about the risks. So the Prime Minister is lying, just like all the rest. Greta sighs. It's not like everyone has messed it up. There are a few, and to be able to save the planet, we have to take up the fight against them and their companies and their money and hold them accountable. I thought that was a really telling quote. The bad news, the lessons from the planet of the humans. And we have some lessons to learn from this much criticized and somewhat flawed documentary. The lessons? Most climate and environmental organizations have not acknowledged the failure of unlimited growth. The concept of a Green New Deal and the concept that the Green New Deal will solve everything. There is always a seduction and corruption of money. With the film, the documentary points that out very well. There are a couple of examples of that, some of which we're more or less familiar with. I was active in an organization of health services research around the time that the Clintons were first running for office, for the presidency. And overnight, the organization was literally bought out by the insurance industry, and the old boys who had their hands out looking for that grant funding all just sort of rolled over and said, they went from saying, the economists went from saying, oh, we can do universal health care and pay for, and single payer and pay for it until 2040. There's that much waste in the system. They went from that to, oh, it won't work overnight. The other example is, I don't know if you folks remember, the Pacifica relocation to District of Columbia and the disaster that brought up with it as the members of the Pacifica National Board became more and more sort of cozying up to the DC powers, and almost lost the network to, it almost got sold because of that board, the particular board's desire to make a little money, cozy up to power. So also resorting to top-down versus bottom-up solutions. I think that we've all talked about the fact that it's going to be communities, municipalities, and states that energize and sustain the world leadership with our actions. So in the response to a critique of the sort of out-of-date facts in the film was forwarded by an organization that's fighting for what they're calling steady statementship of growth. That is, non-growth. We simply have to reduce consumption, and reduce the GDP, the gross domestic product. So while the figures noted in Planet may be outdated, the facts they are used to illustrate haven't changed at all. Green growth is an oxymoron, and the conversion to renewables is a damp squib. A squib, by the way, is a fireworks that has a sort of a hiss and then a bang. I love the British. The conversion to renewables is a damp squid if unaccompanied. No, make that unpreceded by the paradigm shift from growth as goal to steady statementship, including the necessary degrowth phase. We have to put the horse before the cart to get to a state of sustainability. So now, moving on to the strong evidence of corporations, politicians, and capitalists taking advantage of the pandemic. They're taking advantage of the pandemic to avoid inspections and regulations. Yes, there are some explanations of the move back to bad air after the pandemic seemed to clear it up. But as this headline and this story from the LA Times, cited, inspectors were sheltering at home, not on the job, not going out in and doing air quality inspections, and industry took advantage to let loose pollutants that they would have otherwise not been able to. On top of that, while the country has been distracted by the pandemic and the chaos of our federal response, there's been wholesale overturning of regulation and public control of production and pollution, especially with our current federal administration. So there's been bailouts. I have to find my notes all printed out. No, it's okay. There have been bailouts for the business as usual. So a good large part of the bailouts went to stoke up stock value and executive salaries, and a little bit trickled down to some worker salaries, rather than investment in a green future and retraining to green alternatives. There's been virtually no discussion in this country of that. This headline speaks for itself. Open license to pollute. Trump administration indefinitely suspends some environmental protection laws during coronavirus pandemic. Under normal circumstances, companies are required to report when they release certain levels of pollution into the air or water. Now the EPA has effectively given over its federal authority to state offices and said companies will be responsible for monitoring their own air and water pollution during this time. It's the case in point. The challenge to the good people of all nations: we must reduce our consumption and balance global consumption. This is the fairness doctrine. We must accept the carrying load of our globe. There's just only so much population that the world is going to support. And we must counter and defeat the private capitalist notion of endless growth and greed in our words, in our deeds, and in our votes. And this has been happening in a little way. To some extent, there is organizing around these rollbacks and loopholes, etc. This is an article about the Public Citizen and the Natural Resources Defense Council partnered to sue the U.S. EPA over the agency's recently announced non-enforcement policy. So that was back in April. And again, the United Nations is taking a lead in a better recovery. So this is, do we think that our government and our fossil fuel industry and the travel industry and the big agribusinesses are going to pay any attention to this call? I think probably not. But I thought the Secretary General of the UN's initiative and his 6 climate-related actions were particularly poignant. So first, the huge amounts of money to be spent on recovery from the coronavirus must deliver new jobs and businesses through a clean, green transition. Second, where taxpayers' money is used to rescue businesses, it must be tied to achieving green jobs and sustainable growth. Third, fiscal firepower must drive a shift from the gray to the green economy, empowering societies and people to be more resilient. Fourth, public funds should be used to invest in the future, not in the past, and flow to sustainable sectors and projects that help the environment and the climate. Fossil fuel subsidies must end, and polluters must start paying for their pollution. Fifth, climate risks and opportunities must be incorporated into the financial system as well as all aspects of public policy making and infrastructure. Sixth, we all need to work together as an international community. That was worth reading. I like this Venn diagram as a way to explore sustainability. Even though it looks simple, there's a lot of complexity to planning for actions that meet all of these requirements for sustainability. As we know, population growth is much higher in developing countries, while resource and consumption and pollution is higher in developed countries. The gap between the ends of the spectrum has been increasing in a similar exponential fashion. The focus of sustainability is as much on humanity, the sort of the social corner of the sustainability Venn diagram, as it is on nature or the ecological. And to reduce inequality and to provide a basic standard of living conditions for the Earth's inhabitants is paramount to the sustainability challenge. These are the kinds of things that are being written about now during the COVID crisis. And finally, these infographics, available online, by the way, are an excellent starting place for a reality of understanding the impact of COVID-19 on world environment. And yes, carbon emissions are down. There's 40% less domestic air traffic. There's a decrease of 50% in carbon monoxide in New York City, and 41 decrease in peak traffic congestion in Seattle, just as examples. In China, the improved air quality may have saved the lives of 4,000 children under 5 years. And then carbon emissions fell by 25%. In Europe, there are fewer air passengers, and there's a decrease in nitrogen dioxide. On the other side of the coin, there's some of the negative impact on the environment of the COVID pandemic, illustrated in this infographic on the impact on waste, the destruction of trees for paper and cardboard, no more bring your own bags to the grocery store, and at least 200 tons of medical waste per day. Is that being burned? Is it being buried? And while this is all going on, we also have Jeff Bezos and the increasing flock of Amazon trucks emitting pollutants into the air, and he's making an extra, was it 24 billion or $30 billion using his filthy diesel trucks. So, I mean, that of course calls for our support of the workers organizing from within, the deliverers and packers. And I think there was, even yesterday, I didn't note it down and get it into this presentation, but there was an additional action against Amazon yesterday. So it brings me to my conclusion, which we might open up the discussion. So right now, it is the vulnerable of the world that are suffering and dying, both from COVID-19 and the climate. How could it have been avoided? Can we avoid it? I mean, can we change? Can we bend that arc? And the other question is, how do we communicate about the calamitous die-off, both COVID-19 and climate, related to population concentrations, the need for expanded markets given the current economic models, the cheap labor, the exploitation and extreme extraction that is going on. So I'm ready to open up the comments, questions, suggestions.
I'm going to open my chat bar here. So, okay, yeah. I actually cannot see all of you at the moment.
Oh, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If some